Hello, goblins and ghouls. So today I'm going to talk about rock, pop, blurred genre distinctions, and mutant forms. And, basically touching upon how music changes and uh, modifies itself over time, even if it's mostly in a roundabout way, the imperceptible changes. And, well, first off, I do want to say that music genres and styles, they do tend to have staying power. Most are not exactly short lived, even if they appear to be quickly superseded in popularity by others. But they don't tend to disappear forever. There is often a nostalgia factor and some resurgence. Like right now, it seems like 1980s and even 90s nostalgia has a comeback. And eventually, I'm sure it'll be something else. I remember during the 1990s themselves, there was sort of a nostalgia for swing music at some point, and in the 1980s, certain movies had kind of a 1950s nostalgia thing going on, like Stand by Me, for example, and you had rockabilly and swing music popping up here and there. And it wasn't just Stand By Me, there were some other movies like that happening. So if you're really interested in music, you might want to check out even the most embarrassing, guilty pleasure, or sometimes just awkward and weird, potentially even offensive genres and fad songs, whose influences might even continue to be heard in some important recordings later on. For example, one of the most offensive genres out there is associated with ragtime, what I will refer to as minstrel songs, although there are definitely some other names for them, or for the genre. Some pretty colorful ones. I'll leave you to do that investigating. It's also important to remember that pop music was not always stuff like Britney Spears, Backstreet Boys, or even Michael Jackson or Madonna. There was a time where rock and roll was considered pop music. And really, 20th century pop is music that became popular through mass media and originated in the era when the pop song was basically a new idea. Obviously, most music that came out that was called rock was relatively tame, at least by today's standards, but at the time it was controversial. I think people should really remember that. And if you want to get a good idea of that, you can watch a movie like Ray, and the movie about Ray Charles, the biopic, and you'll see that it's at least suggested that even he was controversial, and not just for things going on in his personal life, but due to the musical form itself. And a lot of music came from the European classical tradition, which was considered a serious form, and along came things like rock music or pop, as it was called, and that was considered less serious. Don't get me wrong, I do like some classical music, so it's not just something that snobs can listen to, but even classical ended up having renegades of sorts who ended up going in avant-garde directions. So there were even mutations in classical music. Pop music obviously had its own mutations over the years, to the point where rock music ended up being viewed sometimes as entirely separate from pop, if not the antithesis of it, regarding plenty of underground genres like punk and extreme metal, obviously not as pop-oriented, although metal, of course, did have hair bands, as they were called, which was basically pop metal. So I mean, it's a complicated issue, really, if you think about it. And of course, you've got pop punk, and in fact, there was always some pop element to punk. If you think of the Ramones, or even Iggy Pop, he had some songs that were, well, pop oriented. It's even right there in his name as sort of a suggestion. But rock and roll developed in the United States around the 1940s and 1950s, splintering off into so many forms that it would be inconceivable to list them all here, so I'm not going to try to do that. Many of the forms of popular music became influential in subsequent generations, obviously, and that includes some technological innovations as well. So, for a huge example of that, jazz and blues guitarist Les Paul, with his song Lover, When You're Near Me, was innovative for its use of overdubs way back in 1948. So he was a pioneer in that, and that's obviously a pretty huge development in recorded music. This isn't to suggest that someone else wouldn't have eventually come along and been innovative in that way, but there had to be some people who did that first. And Les Paul, he also pioneered the solid body electric guitar, so the guy actually had a major impact on music. Basically, you felt the influence of Les Paul without even realizing it. And he's sort of an overlooked topic of discussion, I would say. One of the one of the most innovative forces in popular music, period. Just based on those two things I mentioned, right? I mean, who hasn't heard of an overdub, or the the Les Paul electric guitar, that's like even a brand of guitar. Thankfully, rock and pop music is not just part of a Western tradition, though some seem to regard it that way, maybe by intent of design. But, in the early, I guess you could say, primitive stages of rock music, it was decidedly American, but it very quickly spread overseas, thanks to broadcasts, recordings, and bands themselves who toured the globe, almost acting as missionaries, spreading a new musical religion across the globe. So keep in mind that rock and pop have many forms of composition, interpretation, and performance, and there will always be innovators as well as those who copy along with the current trends. And they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but I wouldn't say it's always sincere. Sometimes it's, more of a blatant ripoff. Basically, we've moved past the point of declaring officially what music genre can be, whether it's rock, pop, or anything else. Things are just mutating all the time, and it's really interesting to think about where things will end up. So on that note, don't be afraid to pick up some musical instruments, whether it's bass, drums, piano, ukulele, guitar, or even classical instruments, and just play what you want to hear. You don't have to worry so much about genre. That is really just coloring between the lines, and you really don't always have to do that. Play what comes naturally, and who knows, maybe there will be an audience for you somewhere. So that's really basically all I have to say here on this topic. Hopefully what I said made sense. To me it makes sense, but, there's always somebody who won't get it, or who disagrees, or what have you. But anyway, that's about it. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.